Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about something that I touched on in my video last week, and one of my subscribers just boiled it down to a perfect expression in the comments. And you probably already know that expression because I'll probably make it the title of this video. And that expression is, cultural appropriation is our greatest strength. Quite contrary to what you will hear from the left, especially the quote-unquote progressive left, saying diversity is our strength and that cultural appropriation is evil. No. Cultural appropriation is our greatest strength. Now, let me put a caveat on that and say, when I say our, I mean Western culture, very specifically European Western culture. For us, cultural appropriation is our greatest strength. And I'm going to go over the historical parts of that in various ways in this video to prove that to be true. And not only that, but also follows some sidetracks that it leads to show why and how it is best expressed. Now, let me start here a little bit with story, which I admit is kind of an absurd place to start, but I don't know where else to fit it into my argument. I write stories, produce stories. I write and produce graphic novels and comic books. Not a whole lot as of yet, but still, I wish to produce more and more. And just as a sidebar, I am so sorry to everybody who has ordered Crom the Destroyer. We are still working on it. You will get it. Just some elements of it are taking much longer than we had originally anticipated. But I produce comics, and when I started producing my first comics and graphic novels, I had people, especially people on the left, who wanted to attack me saying, "You're just copying from X, Y, and Z. You don't have an original thought in your head." And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, and I really don't care about that kind of criticism. Why? Because cultural appropriation is our strength. And that's the way the history of comic books and superheroes, because my channel is about heroes, but superheroes proceeded in North America over and over again. Batman is a copy of the Shadow. Superman is a copy of Doc Savage. Spider-Man is a copy of Superman. The Fantastic Four is a copy of the Challengers of the Unknown. And don't get me started on the X-Men. Almost every character and every villain in character is a copy from movies. Wolverine is a copy of one of the characters from Slapshot. Kitty Pryde is a copy of Ripley from Aliens. Some of their villains, like Pierce, is a copy of Donald Sutherland from The Body Snatchers. Shaw is a copy of Robert Shaw from Jaws and several other pieces of movies, possibly Where Eagles Dare. Either the White Queen or the Black Queen, I can't remember which, is a copy of the main female character from the British show Avengers, etc., etc., etc. People are just copying from other people and have been, even through the great stories of this medium, until that story has taken on a life of its own and become something new. Because the character of Wolverine, for example, is going to be remembered much more fondly than anyone is even going to remember the character from Slapshot. But again, this all plays into a mindset of cultural appropriation in European-based society, and it goes through the strains of everything, including story, which are really reflections of who we are. And I would say very much in things like superhero stories or any kind of heroic story, because of its tie to virtue, which I will get into in a couple of minutes. Now, here's an odd little thing about cultural appropriation, which shows you that it is indeed a strength. It is how the left, especially the quote-unquote progressive left, define it and use it. One of the key points in the literature of the left for over 150 years now is demonize your enemy's strengths by attaching negative connotations and words to it so that they diminish in that strength. It's one of their go-tos of how to operate. And that's exactly what they're doing with cultural appropriation. They're saying, oh no, this is an evil thing. This is an istophobe of this kind or that kind. You must distance yourself from it. Why? Because they know it's our strength. And these people, especially the far left, want to destroy European-based Western culture. And it's obvious that they know it's a strength because they themselves use it, not just as an effective tool, but as a weapon. Which, by the way, is the only way that you can use cultural appropriation if all you think about is power, and all they think about is power because they have no tie in their system to virtue. So, just to give a scattered number of examples of how they're doing this, let's look at the current iterations of Lord of the Rings. What did Tolkien create the Lord of the Rings for? It's supposed to be an unwritten mythology, a sort of found manuscript of mythology for a very specific part of English culture, most particularly rural English culture. So I'm sorry to the people who are creating the new Lord of the Rings stuff, but there are no black hobbits. There are no black dwarves. Quite specifically, I'm rereading Lord of the Rings right now. When he says swarthy individuals, you can tell that's what he means. And those people are far and distant, and most notably, yes, usually on the side of evil. So no, I'm sorry, these things don't exist. In putting in black hobbits and black dwarves, what are you doing? What is the left doing? Well, it's engaging in cultural appropriation. Lord of the Rings is a cultural touchstone for European, very specifically English European society. You can also see it in the various historical dramas, where they're putting different kinds of races besides Europeans into historical context of Europeans, where they have, for example, members of various European monarchies being portrayed by a black person, or Mozart being portrayed by someone who is Asian. They are doing this very specifically for a very specific reason. You might just say, oh, they're a good actor, therefore they can fulfill this role. No, that kind of actor was put in this role specifically for cultural appropriation. And we know that because they're doing the exact same thing to history. They're trying to convince people in Great Britain that their ancestors were black, taking things like Cheddar Man, which is the oldest skeletal remains they found in the British Isles, and then covering it with skin, which is black. This is absurd. Not to mention the fact that even if he did have that color skin, it would have absolutely zero connection to the people of that color skin of today. This is cultural appropriation. Same with them making Vikings black and claiming that Vikings now were ancestors of black people. This is all nonsense. Why? Because it's cultural appropriation. Why? Because the left is using cultural appropriation because they know it's a strength. And the only way that they can use it is, again, as a weapon because they have no connection to virtue. Now let's go back to the historical context of why cultural appropriation is the strength specifically of European peoples. And once again, this in part goes back to story, but as I like to say in this channel, when academia was actually stringent in being academic, we were taught that Western civilization peeled itself off from the rest of the surrounding civilizations because it had two parents which acted in a different way. Those two parents are Greece and Jerusalem. Greece usually being represented by Athens, but really it means Greece as a whole. So I'll just say Athens and Jerusalem. And they did this, to some extent, both of them through cultural appropriation. For the Greeks, if you look at their mythology, it is cultural appropriation over and over and over again. The Greeks were very good in building their civilizations because when they ran into other civilizations that had more advanced ideas than them, they would either defeat them, take them over, or take what they had, which was good, incorporate it into their culture, and then go back and take them over. And we can see this in their expression of mythology because they tied these people, which they subjected and made Greek in a sort of way, by tying their local gods into the mythology of the Greek culture itself. That's why you have, let's say, the theogony. It's very confusing because you got this infusing of gods from other places over and over and over again as the Greeks conquer. As the Greeks conquer, they cultural appropriate before or after, depending on how they needed to do it, and then subjected that culture by saying, okay, your gods are the same gods as ours. This one is connected to that one. And oh, by the way, if we have one of yours that is not connected to ours, we'll just shove it in the pantheon as well. Again, this is a direct connection to the cultural appropriation that made the Greeks great. And by the way, it is their mythology, which is the source of their greatest contribution to Western society, which would be philosophy. And if you want some academic points on that entire thing, go read something like F.M. Cornfort's From Religion to Philosophy. And if we move on to Jerusalem, I would say just look at something like Philippians 4. Yes, they're Christians, but they started off as Jewish people. Let's use that as our example from Jerusalem. Philippians 4 says, "For the rest, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever modest, whatsoever just, whatsoever holy, whatsoever lovely, whatsoever of good fame, if there be any virtue, if any praise of discipline, think on these things." And this is very much an expression of don't be bogged down with your own culture. If you see something good, especially tied to virtue, if it's tied to the principles of existence, hold on to that thing. Incorporate that thing into what you need and what you use. Very much the idea of cultural appropriation. Now, you might say that's a bit of a stretch, but I would say no, because it's very much connected to an idea which was floating around exactly at that time, the idea of Aristotle. Aristotle, by the way, who did very unique things at that point in time, things that we just think of as normal today, by taking, let's say, constitutions from various city-states all over the place and comparing them and saying, let's pick out the good parts of each. Again, back to cultural appropriation. But what did Aristotle say? Only a couple of hundred years before this passage in Philippians was written, and very much influenced that society again, with these two societies joining together to make Western civilization. Aristotle said, if there is any good thing that you run into, and it is possessed by a person who is not virtuous, do not blame that thing. Blame the individual who owns it, and then, with all of your strength, seek to praise that good thing by taking it away from them. And this is the process of the growth of European civilization. It is running into other cultures, other expressions of humanity, and taking away from them the good things that have virtue within them, and, if done virtuously, can be expressed as cultural appropriation. Quite honestly, just another quick example. One of the jewels of our civilization right now is science. And what is science based on? Well, partly, to a great part, it's based upon math. It's also based a little bit upon geometry. And no, those aren't specifically the same thing. They do overlap in certain ways. But honestly, I can remember taking Euclidean geometry in grade 11. During the entire year, we never used any numbers at all. But here's the thing. If you try doing math of any complexity with Roman numerals, you're in for a world of hurt. Therefore, the advancement of European Western civilization came within our cultural appropriation of Arabic numbers and their number system, which, by the way, they had used and developed in an odd sort of way from cultural appropriation of geometry from the ancient Greeks. So it's not just Western civilization, but I would say Western civilization does it the best because they connect it to virtue. Because quite honestly, our numbering system, which is much more simplistic, which is Arabic in nature, which derives itself backwards in time from Greek geometry, is based upon geometry. Each number in its original form was an expression of how many angles it had of a certain degrees. One wasn't a straight line, it was a little tick at the top and then a straight line down, which is one angle of a certain degrees. 2 had 2 angles because it looked like a Z of a certain degrees. 3, which looked like a sideways M, had 3 angles of a certain degrees. 4 had 4 angles of a certain degrees, etc., etc. And then you add the concept of 0 in there. 0 is written as a circle because it has no angles. Anyways, I love geometry. I could go on and on about that. But yeah, the point being, our science is based upon mathematics. Mathematics is based upon our numbering system. Our numbering system came into European culture through cultural appropriation. And we used it much more thoroughly than the people who had originally come up with it because we connected to virtue. Now, let's bring all that forward to the current day just to bring that connection forward for a second. I would say things like cultural appropriation are the reason why in our civilization today we have the idea of the open marketplace of ideas where ideas compete and the best one comes out on top, which is another way of saying systems of merit, which, of course, the left hate. Now, this idea used to literally be a system of 2 men enter, 1 man leaves, which is to say a violent sort of conflict, but we've sublimated that, we've channeled that into the conflict of ideas because we connect it to virtue and say, we don't need this actual physical conflict. We can just have the conflict of ideas, have which one that is best come out on top, and then use it no matter where it comes from. And that's how we're going to build our society. But that violence, which is definitely inherent in the system, come and see the violence inherent in the system. Sorry, but there is a check to that violence through the use of virtue. But that violence is always there, which is where my next point follows. Now, I could go on and on about examples of cultural appropriation throughout European civilization, but let's connect it to that point now of why I keep saying connected to virtue. As I said about the left, earlier in this video, saying that they don't use cultural appropriation in any way except as a weapon, specifically because all they're concerned with is power and therefore have no connection to virtue. I don't say this lightly. I say this because if you look throughout European civilization, you will see cultural appropriation itself sparking into power-based conflicts over and over again. So I'm not going to sweep this under the rug. Yes, indeed, cultural appropriation, if used in a non-virtuous way, leads very much to violence and conflict. That's just straight up true. I'm not going to hide from that fact. And you can see it over and over again throughout the history of Western civilization, specifically European civilization. So let's start pulling on that thread here. Many of you have probably seen my video about the crumbling of the World War II myth. And I say that because it is the most popular video on my entire channel. And the thing is that we live in this mythology created by World War II. And World War II came about because of World War I. And World War I came about because of the unification of these great powers within Europe, which had not been able to unify prior to that point. Basically, the unification of Germany and Italy in the 1860s, which isn't that long ago. And the reason why these conflicts started to arise was because of that unification, and that unification, which, by the way, historically, I would say, came about because of the invention of dynamite, which allowed people to blow through the mountains and create, well, not just roads, but also railroads, to connect all of these small pockets of civilization that had, European civilization, that had developed on their own, mainly because of the mountainous areas in which they developed, which allowed them to have, in the case of the Holy Roman Empire, you got hundreds of versions of the same country, each taking their own path, which allowed for diversity of thought, which allowed for diversity of invention. And then they're all combined together when these roads started plowing through within the 1860s, well, mid-1800s, and tried to connect them together. And then cultural appropriation and conflict from that cultural appropriation took over. And then we have things like World War II. There is a direct correlation there. But again, it was the fact that you had all of these smaller kingdoms and bishoprics and principalities trying to connect themselves together, and one coming out as dominant because the others had to subject themselves to the cultural superiority of the dominant culture. Again, each one using the others through things like cultural appropriation, causing strife and conflict because specifically an abandonment of virtue at that specific time in history, rather focusing on utility. But again, we see these connection of different cultures where one eclipses the other through things like cultural appropriation, and then conflict arising from it, which once again leads to catastrophic conclusions when not tied to virtue, like World War I, like World War II. So again, I'm not sweeping this under the rug. I would say, in my estimation, yes, the left is right in the fact that European civilization is inherently violent. Why? Because cultural appropriation is our strength. And if you use it incorrectly, it goes from a system of development to a system of conflict and violence. People would be surprised, and I've said this before, people would be surprised at how much I actually agree with the quote-unquote progressive left. They come up with these ideas, and I would say, yeah, that's the right idea. But then they try to state the origin of those ideas, and I'll say, no, that's not the actual origin of it. And then they'll call it evil, and I'll say, no, that's actually good. Let me give you one absurd example before moving on to one that's connected to this entire thing. Well, I suppose this one has a connection too. Anyways, do you remember a couple of years ago when around the internet that clip from a talk show where an overweight African American woman was claiming that African American women were fatter than their white counterparts because of systemic racism? And everybody were just ridiculing this entire thing. I looked at it and went, well, yeah, she's kind of right. Why? Because the way that the body works is that when you're under stress, it takes the food you intake and it turns it into fat instead of using it directly. And so if you're under massive amounts of stress, then yeah, the diet systems aren't going to work. Because of that stress, it's still going to get turned into fat. And these people believe there's systemic racism, which makes them constantly in a fight, flight, or freeze mode, which is a mode wherein food gets turned into fat. So yeah, she's kind of right. Now, she's wrong on the fact that it's the cause of systemic racism. I would say, no, it's the cause of you believing that systemic racism exists, and it's the left that's telling you that it exists, your own side, causing you to be stressed, causing you to be fat. So it's either, I would say, you not being able to deal with reality and therefore having mental problems, which perhaps you should go to a mental institution, or you just can't accept the fact that you're a conquered people, too bad, so sad. 6 of one, half dozen of another. See what I mean? Technically, she's right, but for the wrong reasons. And the other one that I want to bring up was a clip going around the internet from, I think it was a podcast, to African Americans. I can't remember if they were American, if they were European, British, something. They were basically saying that white people, because of the color of their skin, were more inherently violent than people with more melanin in their skin. And he was made fun of relentlessly, especially on the right. And I'm looking at what he's saying and going, I can see how that can be true. I'm not saying absolutely it is true, but I can see very much how it might be true. Yeah, I think Europeans are more violent. Why? It could be because, again, the human body works in a way where we need vitamin D. The level of melanin in your skin is basically a correlation to where you live and how much vitamin D you can intake. And when you don't have access to those basic things you need to live, sometimes you're going to substitute other ways of making your life easier so that you can get by. And one of those ways is through conflict. So I'm lacking this essential thing, like an intake of vitamin D. Therefore, I have to, subject the people around me so they do all the work so that I can spend more time outside and leisure. I can see that possibly being very much the way that it is. And yeah, that would lead very much into the idea that Europeans are much more violent than the people around them. Okay, I don't agree with why he states that to be true, but I think, yeah, that's very much possibly the case. And why could people move into these harsher climes wherein they have less access to things like vitamin D through the sun? Well, it's because they use methods like cultural appropriation. Not just conquest, but taking over civilizations and taking what they have, taking it from them and using it, incorporating it into their own civilization. That's how you can move farther north and north. You hit another culture and you don't just wipe them out. You look at how they're able to interact with their surroundings and say, okay, we're going to do that in order to survive in this place. Don't just take them over and wipe them out. Take them over and use them. Then maybe wipe them out later. This is the process of European civilization. Once again, I think driven to a great extent by geography and the fact that the more harsher the climate becomes, the more you have to adapt, incorporate local ways of living, and come up with new ideas, all of which spring out of ideas and behaviors like cultural appropriation. Which, by the way, as a little bit of a side note, have you ever wondered why the great civilizations moved farther and farther north? And the people who are in places where there's an abundance of resources and very few people just seem to be lazy? We'll say lazy on the cultural scale as compared with the great civilization. It's because they had no conflict, or at the very least, few areas of conflict that would demand that they change. Those few areas of conflict would be conflict with the people around them, whereas the farther and farther north you go, you not only have conflict with the people around you, but with the harsher climate as well. And you gotta adapt. You gotta come up with new ways of figuring out how to live and survive and prosper. Now let's tie that in a weird sort of way all together with virtue and its connection to cultural appropriation. I'll use a sort of personal connection to explain all that. I myself am a Highland Scot. My ancestors come from the Highlands of Scotland, and I have read the official accounts of the lords, the English lords and Scottish lords, who were anglicized at that time, who came into the Highlands and displaced my specific ancestors from where they lived and shipped them off to North America. Literally, I've read the historic accounts which displaced my very specific ancestors. And it was these lords saying, these Highlanders, they're just lazy. But they're used to harsh conditions, so let's take them and stick them in North America, which is harsh conditions, and get them out of the way so we can use their land for something more productive where we don't have these lazy people for basically at least a quarter of the year doing nothing. Which they said that because the Highland Scots lived in a very close association with nature. That is to say, when weather was good, they hyper-focused on trying to produce as much as possible through hunting and fishing and agriculture. And when the winter months would come, they would have to live off the fat of all that they collected because they couldn't do any of that. But whereas the English or the Scottish anglicized lords would see that as them being lazy, they weren't actually lazy during that time of winter where they couldn't do anything quote unquote productive. Why? Because what they did during winter was prepare for war. And again, why? Because you're in a harsh clan system where you're going to come in conflict with your neighbor sooner or later. Be prepared for war. If you want peace, prepare for war. And just as a side note, I found it very funny in reading these historical accounts because I was looking at the Highland way of living and going, isn't that the way people are supposed to live? And I sat down and thought, why do I think that? And I thought it because that's how my grandfathers lived. That's how my mother and father were brought up for the first at least 15 years of their lives. They lived in sections of North America that were basically medieval towns. No electricity, no running water, no indoor plumbing, nothing but horsepower. And yes, work strenuously in the good parts of the year and then fallow in the places and times where you could do nothing. Anyways, that's just my connection to it, basically saying I thought a lot about these ideas because they influence me greatly to the extent that I usually place myself in a place to live where it's fairly harsh. Why? Because like my ancestors, I need a kick in the pants of the harshness of the weather in order to get myself to do things. I really do. I'm sorry, I can't live in the Bahamas or some section of the Caribbean where everything is nice all year round because I would be lazy. I need the harshness of winter kicking my butt saying, get out there and do this now in order to get me to do things. And here's the thing. This is the problem with North American culture to some extent. I very much like the theory of, who is it, Thomas Sowell? Which, by the way, just for the people at YouTube listening to this, he is an African-American, I would say, historian and philosopher. That's what I would call him. But his theory is that why is African-American culture so lazy, violent, and prone to criminality? He says, because that culture comes out of the South, and in the South, they borrowed that culture from the Scots who arrived there and were lazy and prone to criminality and violence. Why? Because they were taken out of their harsh conditions of, let's say, the Highlands and put in this place, which is the South of America, which is basically the land of milk and honey for a Scotsman. And since they didn't have the check of the harsh winter and harsh conditions, they became lazy and violent and criminal. Once again, because they're used to things like cultural appropriation, where you go, I'm going to take that from you because there's something good there, but not connected to virtue anymore because technically they weren't virtuous to begin with. I'll say this of my own people. They were controlled by the harsh environment. So where am I going with all of this? And how is it connected in any way to the stuff I was talking about at the first? Well, it's connected in this way. The Scotsmen, my ancestors, are the canary in the coal mine of how we must use cultural appropriation in a very specific, virtuous way. Why? Because our civilization, Western civilization, because of the use of things like cultural appropriation, creating things like science, have created a system, no matter where you live, that you have become overly comfortable. And if you've become overly comfortable and you have previously dependent upon the harsh conditions around you in order to keep you in check, in order to keep things like your cultural appropriation from turning into simple power grabs and being used like the left does with no connection to virtue, if you wish to use this thing in a way that is going to support and build our civilization rather than tear it down, then there must be a limit to it. There must be a check to it. And that check, since there is no physical check to it anymore because we've made ourselves so comfortable, is virtue. So basically, I'm saying that, you see, well, this is very much a Western European way of thinking about things. It's to say that something like cultural appropriation is not good or bad in itself. It's good or bad in how you use it. We have used it historically as Europeans in a very positive way. It has tended to get out of hand and lead to violence and conflict over and over again, making us very violent people, I will admit, but it can be used in a very productive way, and we have had a strain throughout the building of our culture of Western civilization to use it in a productive way that makes us better and better and better, and makes our civilization better and better and better. But to use it in a correct way, if we do not have the physical limits of discomfort, which we don't anymore because of our reliance on science and our exaltation to it to an extreme where we don't have discomfort from the natural surroundings anymore, then we must incorporate the very specific origin of it, which said, in one of its original forms, take these praiseworthy things and meditate upon them. Take them unto yourself, especially if they are just and true and good and virtuous. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And by the way, on a personal note, I am recording this video on the 1st of November, 2025, which means that tonight is the 7th game of the World Series. And all I got to say to that, in the spirit of competition and merit, is, okay, Blue Jays, let's play ball. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see y'all later.